In this task, we have to separate a text file containing numbers into two different categories, and we can use either arrays or lists to store the integer category and then the real number category separately from each other. So to prepare to program this task, I have set up a text file called numbers.txt inside my Java project, and you can see here that there's a mixture of real numbers and integers. Sign doesn't really matter in this task. It might be something we have to bear in mind, but for planning ahead here, I'm putting some negative numbers in there as well. In order to generate that list of numbers in the first place, I used Excel and I used the following formulae. I had rand between, which would give me a random integer in the range -10 to 10. And then separately I'd used rand just to give me a random real number in the range 0 to 1. So I then added those two numbers together to give me numbers like 4.54642. Then I chose some cells in this column at random, and I simply put in a formula like equals A5, bringing across the original integer value, and that gave me then a mixture of real numbers and integers, which I then just copied and pasted directly into NetBeans, into the text file, to save me having to type out lots of numbers. So in this case, the requirement for some global variables means that I'm going to have to put some items outside of the main method so that they can be accessed from any other method. The concept of global scope, it is somewhat muddied once you bring it into an object-oriented programming language such as Java, but we'll just go on ahead with this. So I'm going to create two arrays, both of which are designed to store their respective data types. So I'm going to have an array of integers, and I'm going to call it ints, and I'm going to have an array of real numbers, so I'll use the double data type, and I'm going to call it doubles, and that's going to be my global variable. And inside the main method of my program, then I'm going to have to do the interaction with the file and consider then the various sub-steps that need to be dealt with in order to be able to build these arrays. Because these are arrays, we have a problem to contend with, which is that arrays are static data structures, which means that they have a fixed size. So before we can really go building these arrays, we're going to have to calculate in advance what size they need to be. Otherwise, we're going to get into an awkward situation where we're constantly throwing away an old array and building a new one, and that's tedious to say the least. So to get started with the work involved then in interacting with the text file, we're going to have to start bringing in some ideas here. So we're going to create a file variable, and I'll call it numFile. And that equals a new file variable, and then inside the round brackets here as a parameter we're going to have to provide the path to the file here. So we're going to right click on that, we're going to say properties, and it's going to give us the path. Let's do Control and C on the keyboard, and then we can just close these two small windows. Because the double quotes have been typed in ahead of time, when I paste this using Control and V, NetBeans will automatically double up the backslashes here. That will be necessary to prevent any problems with the backslash being used as an escape sequence character. You can see that the file class or the file data type is not recognized just at the minute. I'm going to let the NetBeans IDE help me here, and I'm going to allow it to import the file class. I'm conscious that we will be importing other things such as a file reader, so I'm just going to mark that with an asterisk so that it imports the file class and the file reader class, and indeed any of the other associated classes that this program might need. So let's press end on the keyboard to take a new line here. Okay, I'll create some space here for me to do the work. So the next step is going to be engaging with a file reader, and let's just call it FR, and we'll say it's a new file reader, and this is going to create an input stream that allows data to flow into our Java program and be interacted with. It's going to be connected to numFile, and that should be good to go. Now, you can see here that NetBeans is warning us that there is an unreported exception, and again I'm going to let the NetBeans IDE help me here. Rather than introducing too much complexity, I'm going to add the throws clause there at the top. Okay, so how are we going to solve this problem? So we've got this ability then to connect to the file. By the way, fr.close would be a good idea because it's very important to close your file after you've opened it and create an input stream. It's very important to close that input stream. So the warning here again about input-output exceptions, let's allow it to add the input-output exception up here as something that may be thrown in the course of running the main method. Okay, so how are we going to solve this? We are going to open the text file. We're going to get the program to open the text file, and we are going to be able to take the data in to the program perhaps as all one string, or perhaps as individual characters and so on. So what I propose in this case is that we read in the entire file as one string first, and then we close the file and we proceed with the rest of our work. So after having read in all of the data, we then start to inspect the contents of the file, determine whether it's an integer or a real number, and then start building the arrays. So let's use fr then. So when we're reading in from a file, we're actually reading in integers for the characters. So the character that has been read is going to be read in using fr.read, and that's going to read in one particular character. This is what we call our priming read. It's the first time that we have read in any characters. We're then going to use a while loop to control the continuous iterative reading of the file. So while the character that has been read is not equal to -1, that means that we have read something that isn't the end of file character. So we're going to do our work, and then we're going to read another character. So what does doing the work mean? Well, we're going to have to build a string here to store the file's contents. So we'll call it file contents, and we'll initialize it to be the empty string. Then each time we read in a character, the character that's been read can then be appended onto the end of this string. In order to do that, well, character read does give us the first character and any subsequent characters that have been read. However, we're going to have to typecast it into character format before we can append it to the file. So that completes the steps of opening the text file, reading in all the contents of the text file, and then closing the file. Just to check before we go any further that things are working out okay in our solution, what we'll try and do is we'll output all of the file contents. So let's save that and just run the program as it is, just to observe what's happening. So the story so far is we have been able to successfully read in all of the data from the file. We have closed the file, so we no longer need to go back to it. Okay, now we proceed to separate the contents. So the next step is going to be to split the big long string with all of the numbers in it into separate strings. So what we'll do is we'll build an array of strings, and we'll call it nums as text. And what we'll do is we'll take our file contents and we will use the split feature in Java, the split method, and we'll split it everywhere where we find the new line character. This means that each of the individual numbers will all be found as separate array values. In order to check that this has worked, we can just quickly build a for loop. I used FORI tab in NetBeans to quickly set up the for loop, and it has correctly set up the for loop structure. And then within it, we simply want to do system.out.print, maybe print line, and we want to read nums as text at position I as, yeah, print line. We'll just run that. Looks good. So now that we have converted the text file into an array of strings where each individual string is just one of the numbers, such as this being treated as a string, we can now start to consider building the array. So what we're going to have to do is count how many of the elements actually have a dot in them, because if we know how many of them have a dot in them, then that means that we have been able to figure out how many are real numbers. Count how many strings contain the dot character. Okay, so we're going to use, we can actually recycle our testing loop here. So rather than keeping it in there, we can just bring it down here. So what we're going to do is, we're going to set up two integers. In fact, we only really need one. Number with dots, let's set it equal to 0. And then as we go through the for loop, if the value in nums as text at position I in the for loop contains, and then we ask it, does it contain the dot character? Then if it does, then the number of strings with dots in them gets incremented. Otherwise nothing will happen. By the end of the for loop, we will know how many of them contain dots. We can then say num without dots, and we can say that, well, that's the size or the length of the array, which is all of the numbers, subtract the number that do have dots. This then tells us the numbers that we're going to need in order to set up our two arrays, or two global arrays, properly. So because these have been declared outside of the main method and outside of all methods, we can now just bomb on ahead and use them. So we can say that ints becomes equal to a new integer array, and the size of that integer array is the number of strings that does not contain dots. You can see here it says non-static variable cannot be referenced from a static context. To solve that problem, we just go up and we label these as being static. Don't worry about understanding that at GCSE level. And next we're going to have our array of doubles, and it's going to be built as a new array of doubles, and the size of that array is going to be the number of strings that actually have dots. Finally, now that we've set up the two arrays, we can now go ahead and populate them by iterating back through all of the contents again. This time we can recycle our existing for loop because it's set up with all the logic ready to go. So if the string contains a dot, then what we're going to do is insert it into the array, and if it doesn't, then we're going to insert it into the other array. So we're going to be advancing through three different arrays here, so we're going to need three different pointers. So we'll call it, let's create an integer called int step, and we'll set it equal to 0. Let's create another integer called double step, and we'll set it equal to 0. What's going to happen is, if we find that it does contain a dot, then double step is going to increment, but at the same time we're going to insert the value into that array. So we're going to say doubles at the position given by double step becomes equal to, and then we put in the value itself, which is nums at text I, but convert it into a double. And to do that we do double dot parse double, like that, with a closing bracket at the end. That will convert the string into double format, and then advance the pointer. And then same story for the integers, is that we have the ints array at int step, and we say it becomes integer.parseInt, and we put in then the array element that we found, and then we can increment int step so that it advances through the array each time. And finally we can set up a quick for loop just to see if our code is working. So I've just pasted that in just to squeeze this into the video, and then we can run our program, and this should show us then our two separate lists. Here's our list of integers, and then here's our list of real numbers.